Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to talk about the Lambda Literary Award nominations for 2022. This is an award I follow every year but haven't really done a video about, at least not a specific one, because there are a lot of different categories and that makes it a little bit difficult to do a reaction video for. Unlike other awards that have a lot of different categories, like say the Pulitzer Prizes, it's not as easy to find a narrow, definable category to focus on. Like the Pulitzers, I just talk about the fiction section and maybe we'll throw a nod to something that won in the biography category or the nonfiction category or anything like that. But it's easy to narrow it down to have one access point to talk about the prize. And the same thing for, say, the National Book Awards, just focus on one thing. The reason it's a little more difficult with the Lambda Literary Awards is that they are not separated out by category. Well, they are. There are fiction categories, memoir categories, nonfiction categories, poetry categories, but they are separated by parts of the LGBTQ spectrum. For instance, some of the categories are lesbian fiction, gay fiction, bisexual fiction, transgender fiction, bisexual nonfiction, transgender nonfiction, LGBTQ nonfiction, lesbian poetry, gay poetry, bisexual poetry, transgender poetry, lesbian memoir and biography, gay memoir and biography, lesbian romance, gay romance, LGBTQ anthology, LGBTQ children/middle grade, LGBTQ young adult, LGBTQ comics, LGBTQ drama, LGBTQ erotica, and LGBTQ mystery, and LGBTQ speculative fiction, and then LGBTQ studies. Those are all of the different categories. So you can see it's a little bit difficult to parse through and find one category to focus on. And be warned, I'm about to do the thing that I'm going to complain about, but I'll explain in a minute. It's a little difficult to focus in on one category because I think all of the categories are important. In a recent video, I talked about how to define LGBTQ literature, and my conclusion for it is that it's really difficult to do that because you have so many different categories of people lumped together, and even within one category, people are very different. So it makes it really difficult to pin down what an LGBTQ book is. And the Lambda Literary Awards, which are affectionately known as the Lammies, try to cover a lot of those things. And I think it's really good that they focus on representation by having bisexual categories and transgender categories and things like that. It would be nice to see an asexual category going forward, maybe intersex. I know those are things that don't have a lot of representation, so you kind of have to dig to find things that would fit, but that's part of the problem. Now, the reason I say I'm about to be guilty of that is that I'm going to focus primarily on the lesbian fiction and the gay fiction category when I talk about these books, but that's not because I think those are the only categories that are interesting. I think the other categories are definitely worth a look, worth exploring, and it's good to get to know the books that are nominated for them. But because there are so many books, there are roughly 5 nominees in each category, I wanted to have a manageable number of books to talk about in a video. So I chose the ones that jumped out to me as interesting. And unfortunately, it just so happens that the ones I find the most interesting came from the lesbian fiction and the gay fiction category. I would encourage you to check out the entire list. I'll put a link to it in the description box down below because, as I said, it's really important to get representation for all of these different categories. I'll talk about some of them, but I would encourage you to check out others as well. They might jump out to you more than they would to me. So like I said, my plan here is just to talk about the ones that I found most interesting. I would love to hear from you which ones jumped out to you if you want to take a look at it and let me know in the comment section down below. And actually, I thought all of the nominees in the lesbian fiction and the gay fiction categories sounded interesting. I might not pick them all up for myself, but they all sounded interesting to me. So I am going to cover all of those just to compound the error of focusing on those categories only. The first nominee in the lesbian fiction category is How to Wrestle a Girl by Venita Blackburn. Many of the stories set in Southern California follow a teenage girl in the aftermath of her beloved father's death and capture her sister's and mother's encounters with men of all ages, as well as the girl's budding attraction to her best friend, Esperanza. In and out of school, participating in wrestling and softball, attending church with her hysterically complicated family, and dominating boys in arm wrestling, she grapples with her burgeoning queerness and her emerging body, becoming wary of clarity rather than hoping for it. That last part is really what got me interested, or potentially interested in this book, becoming wary of clarity rather than hoping for it. I think that's a really big coming of age lesson. I think we assume that there are going to be easy answers about lots of things in life, and then there kind of aren't as we get older, and that's actually okay. That's something I tried to teach my foster son a lot. It's a hard lesson to learn. I would be interested in seeing how it plays out here. It's not something I'm going to run out and grab, but it does sound interesting. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to the next one, which is Matrix by Lauren Groff. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because I've already talked about it. I read this book in January, and it is fantastic. All I'm going to say about it is it's about a lesbian girl boss nun, and it's about the ways in which women and their achievements can be overlooked and written over in history. I really liked it a lot, and I would definitely recommend it, and I think Guinness agrees. The next nominee in the lesbian fiction section is Skye Falling by Mia McKenzie. When she was 26 and broke, Skye didn't think twice before selling her eggs and happily pocketing the cash. Now approaching 40, Skye still moves through life entirely and unrepentantly on her own terms, living out of a suitcase and avoiding all manner of serious relationships. Then a 12-year-old girl tracks Skye down during one of her brief visits to her hometown of Philadelphia and informs Skye that she's her egg. Skye's life is thrown into sharp relief, and she decides that it might be time to actually try to have a meaningful relationship with another human being. Spoiler alert, it's not easy. With its endearingly prickly narrator and a cast of characters willing to both challenge her and catch her when she falls, the novel is a clever, moving portrait of a woman and the relationships she thought she could live without. I find that dynamic intriguing, that sort of push and pull of what you expect life to be and what it is, and how often what it is more rewarding than what you expected, or rewarding in ways that you wouldn't have. And I kind of like the idea of this prickly narrator, because so often we really focus on having likable characters, and people can be likably unlikable. I guess anybody who has read A Man Called Ove has basically said that about the book. I have not read it yet, but it seems like this would be sort of in that vein. It sounds like it could be cute. Again, I'm not going to run out and grab it, but it does sound like an endearing, interesting read, and a bit of a twist on a sort of familiar storyline. The next one was a book that was featured on the ALA Notable Titles list, which I did a reaction to earlier this year. I'll put a link to it in the description box down below because it will come into play with another book that we'll talk about today. It's The Five Wounds by Kristen, Valdez, Quade. Now, when I reacted to the ALA list, I talked about how this book had only existed to me as a cover before, and once I actually found out about it, it sounded interesting, and that continues with this description of the book. It's Holy Week in the small town of Las Penas, New Mexico, and 33-year-old unemployed Amadeo Padilla has been given the part of Jesus in the Good Friday procession. He is preparing feverishly for his role when his 15-year-old daughter, Angel, shows up pregnant on his doorstep and disrupts his plans for personal redemption. With weeks to go until her due date, tough Abulian Angel has fled her mother's house, setting her life on a startling new path. Vivid, tender, funny, and beautifully rendered, The Five Wounds spans the baby's first year as 5 generations of the Padilla family converge. And that sounds really interesting. I'll talk about this book again with my Pulitzer predictions because I'm going to put it on there. I don't know how much of a shot it has. I still need to noodle on that a little bit, but it definitely sounds like an interesting book. This is something that I'm going to seek out, maybe like a library hold or something like that. And then the final nominee in the lesbian fiction category is With Teeth by Kristen Arnett, from the author of the New York Times best-selling sensation Mostly Dead Things, which I have heard good things about, by the way. A surprising and moving story of 2 mothers, 1 difficult son, and the limitations of marriage, parenthood, and love. If she's being honest, Sammy Lucas is scared of her son. Working from home in the close quarters of their Florida house, she lives with one wary eye peeled on Samson, a sullen, unknowable boy who resists her every attempt to bond with him. Uncertain in her own feelings about motherhood, she tries her best, driving, cleaning, cooking, prodding him to finish projects for school, while growing increasingly resentful of Monica, her confident but absent wife. As Samson grows from feral toddler to surly teenager, Sammy's life begins to deteriorate into a mess of unruly behavior, and her struggle to create a picture-perfect queer family unravels. When her son's hostility finally spills over into physical aggression, Sammy must confront her role in the mess and the possibility that it will never be clean again. Blending the warmth and wit of Arnett's breakout hit Mostly Dead Things with a candid take on queer family dynamics, With Teeth is a thought-provoking portrait of the delicate fabric of family and the many ways it can be torn apart. I'm not going to try to run out and grab a copy of this, but what I find interesting about it is that so often when you do portray a queer character or a queer family in a book, there's a lot of pressure to make them seem perfect so they can fit in with this sort of ideal situation. And that's not always life. And when you present ideals to people, it can be very disappointing when life is more complicated. So that part sounds really interesting to me. I'm not going to run out and grab it, but I would be interested. If you have read this book, please let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because it sounds like it could be really interesting. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below if you have read With Teeth by Kristen Arnett. Let's move into the 5 finalists for the gay fiction category. The first one is 100 Boyfriends by Brontez Purnell. Transgressive, foul-mouthed, and brutally funny, Brontez Purnell's 100 Boyfriends is a revelatory spiral into the imperfect lives of queer men desperately fighting the urge to self-sabotage. As they tiptoe through minefields of romantic, substance-fueled misadventure, from dirty warehouses and gentrified bars in Oakland to desolate farm towns in Alabama, Purnell's characters strive for belonging in a world that dismisses them for being black, broke, and queer. In spite of it, or perhaps because of it, they shine. Armed with a deadpan wit, Purnell finds humor in even the darkest of nadirs, with the peerless zeal, insight, and horniness of a gay punk messiah. Together, the slice-of-life tales that writhe within 100 Boyfriends are an inimitable tour of an unexposed queer underbelly. Holding them together is the vision of an iconoclastic storyteller as fearless as he is human. Now, again, that's not something I'm going to run out and grab a copy of. I'm not going to try to get it at my library or anything like that, but it does sound really interesting. One, because it focuses on that aspect of being black, broke, and queer in certain ways, and the ways it talks about different experiences and ways of being. And it seems like it also ties into sort of coming of age things where as you try to figure yourself out, you can kind of spiral out and adventure in ways that are mischievous and get into a little bit of trouble. So that part sounds interesting. I don't know that I would want to read it. If you have read it, please let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because I am curious. The next one, I think I might need to seek out, and I don't know if my library is going to have a copy. I'm willing to bet they don't. I haven't looked yet, but I'm willing to bet they don't. So I'm going to have to try to figure out if I'm going to be able to order a copy anytime soon. It's Brickmakers, a novel by Selva Almada, translated by Annie McDermott. I was familiar with this book, but only because I just watched a video from Books and Bow where they talk about their favorite translated books from last year. And this was on the list. I'll put a link to that video in the description box down below, because that's a new to me channel and I really enjoyed that video. And they talked about Brickmakers in that video, and it sounds really fantastic. So it is a piercing and passionate novel set in rural Argentina about violence and masculinity. And that is one of the things that I find really interesting about it, the ways it talks about how toxic masculinity perpetuates itself. The premise is Oscar Tomei and Elvio Miranda, the patriarchs of 2 families of brickmakers, have for years nursed a mutual hatred, but their teenage sons, Pajara and Angelito, somehow fall in love. Shades of Romeo and Juliet. I was actually thinking West Side Story, and that will come back into play later on in the description. Brickmakers begins as Pajaro and Marciano, Angelito's older brother, lie dying in the mud at the base of a Ferris wheel, inhabiting a dreamlike state between life and death. They recall the events that forced them to pay the price of their father's petty feud. So shades of Elif Shafak's book, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, I believe was the title. The Tomei and Miranda families are caught, like the Capulets and Montagues, in an almost mythic conflict, one that emerges from stubborn pride and intractable machismo. Like her heralded debut, The Wind That Lays Waste, Selva Almada's fierce and tender second novel is an unforgettable portrayal of characters who initially seem to stand in opposition but are ultimately revealed to be bound by their similarities. Almada enlarges the tradition of some of the most distinctive prose stylists of our time. In Brickmakers, she furthers her extraordinary explanation of masculinity and the realities of working-class rural life. This is another exquisitely written and powerfully told story by a major international voice. Yeah, I am sold very hard on that book. I'm going to have to try to see if I can find myself a copy of it. The next nominee in the gay fiction section is the first one that I own a copy of. It's Gordo by Jaime Cortez. I discovered this one on the ALA notable list as well and had to immediately buy a copy based on their description of it, but let's see what the Lambda Awards say. Shedding profound natural light on the inner lives of migrant workers, Jaime Cortez's debut collection ushers in a new era of American literature that gives voice to a marginalized generation of migrant workers in the West. Gordo is set in a migrant workers camp near Watsonville, California in the 1970s. A young, probably gay boy named Gordo learns about sex, watches his father's drunken fights, and discovers even his own documented Mexican-American parents are wary of illegal immigrants. These scenes from Steinbeck country, seen so intimately from within, are full of humor, family drama, and a sweet frankness about serious matters. Who belongs to America, and how are they treated? How does one learn decency when laborers, grown adults, must fear for their lives and livelihoods as they try to do everything to bring home a paycheck? Written with balance and poise, Cortez braids together elegant and inviting stories about life on a California camp, in essence redefining what all-American means. Still, sold very hard. Really looking forward to reading this book sometime soon. And I love that the Lammies are not afraid of featuring short story collections. One of the earlier books in this, 100 Boyfriends, seems to be short stories, and How to Wrestle a Girl is also a story collection from the lesbian fiction category, and that is Gordo by Jaime Cortez. The next nominee in the gay fiction section is My Good Son by Huang. In My Good Son, award-winning author Huang explores both the deep power and the profound burdens of parental love through the story of Mr. Skye, a tailor in post-Tiananmen China, and his only son, Feng. Like many of his generation, Mr. Skye's most fervent desire is for his son to succeed. He manages to get Feng to pass his entrance exams and turns to an American customer, Jude, to sponsor his studies in the States. This scheme, hatched between the older Chinese man and a handsome gay American expat, exposes readers to the parallels and differences of American and Chinese cultures, father-son relationships, familial expectations, sexuality, social mobility, and privilege. Huang's writing abounds with sharp insights and quiet humor, revealing the complexity of family relationships amidst two rapidly changing cultures. That one sounds really interesting to me as well. That is one that I'm probably going to see if my library has a copy. I don't know that I want to buy a copy, but I'm going to earmark it and see if and when it might be available, because it sounds really interesting, especially that dynamic of the rapidly changing cultures and the differences between the two families and their cultures. Sounds really interesting. The next one is another book that I own but have not read, Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. In the 1950s, ex-boxer Norman Alonso is a determined and humble Jamaican who has immigrated to Britain with his wife and children to secure a brighter future. Blighted with unexpected illness and racism, Norman and his family are resilient, but are all too aware that their family will need more than just hope to survive in their new country. At the turn of the millennium, Jesse seeks a fresh start in London, escaping a broken immediate family, a repressive religious community, and his depressed hometown in the industrial Black country. But once he arrives, he finds himself at a loss for a new center of gravity and turns to sex work, music, and art to create his own notions of love, masculinity, and spirituality. A wholly original novel as tender as it is visceral, Rainbow Milk is a bold reckoning with race, class, sexuality, freedom, and religion across generations, time, and cultures. I've heard really great things about this book, so I'm very much looking forward to reading it. And that was the final nominee in the gay fiction section, actually. So I'm going to jump around a little bit through some of the other categories, and I'm only going to talk about books that sounded interesting. Like I said, hopefully you see why I felt like I wanted to talk about all of the books that were nominated for lesbian fiction and gay fiction, because it's not that that's all I want to pay attention to. It's that I found something really interesting about all of those books. And to be honest with you, I could have found something really interesting to talk about a lot of the books that are nominated in other categories, but I just really want to be careful about not making this video too long. So I'm going to encourage you to explore the other categories for yourself. So let's talk about one of the nominees in the bisexual fiction category, which is Monster in the Middle by Tiphanie Yanique. It's another one that I own and have not gotten around to reading. This was one of my most anticipated books in the latter half of last year, and I just didn't get around to it. So I would like to get to it at some point this year. It's about a couple that meets in the 21st century in New York, and how whether or not their love story will succeed is tied to their family history and a sort of generational trauma. I don't know what about the book makes it fit in the bisexual fiction category, but that does intrigue me even more. So I'd love to get into this book and find out about it. Then let's jump to the transgender fiction category, where Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters is perhaps predictably one of the nominees. That is a pretty well-known book from last year. It was even a long-listed title for the Women's Prize. And there have been some very hardcore love it reactions to that book. There have been some hardcore hated it reactions to that book. And It sounds like the type of book that I should immediately want to read, and I've been very hesitant about it for some reason. I think part of it is that the protagonist of the book detransitions and ends up starting a family. And in the era of J.K. Rowling, it seems like that type of plotline is a minefield. But I actually recently had a conversation with Sean the Book Maniac, and he convinced me that I should probably give it a try. I'm not going to rush out and do that. I don't plan to prioritize it, but I am open to the idea of trying it now. And it does sound like a really interesting book. There's probably a lot to talk about in it as well. The next one from the transgender fiction category is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. In 1345, China lies under harsh Mongol rule. For the starving peasants of the Central Plains, greatness is something found only in stories. When the Zhou family's eighth-born son, Zhou Changba, is given a fate of greatness, everyone is mystified as to how it will come to pass. The fate of nothingness received by the family's clever and capable second daughter, on the other hand, is only as expected. When a bandit attacks, though, it is Zhou Changba who succumbs to despair and dies. Desperate to escape her own fated death, the girl uses her brother's identity to enter a monastery as a young male novice. There, propelled by her burning desire to survive, Zhu learns she is capable of doing whatever it takes, no matter how callous, to stay hidden from her fate. Now, of course, this being set in a time when transgender identity was not really understood and there was no definable term for it, that would make this really interesting. Also, it would be interesting to know how much of it parallels the story of Mulan and how much of it is really, because Mulan is not a transgender character, but since this is nominated in transgender fiction, it seems to imply that this might be. And that push and pull is part of what I find interesting about it, like how much of it is similar to a story we're already familiar with. But the idea of it as well sounds really interesting. This sort of bait and switch where the one son is called for a fate of greatness and the daughter is called for a fate of nothingness, but then the daughter takes on the son's identity when he dies unexpectedly. That sounds really interesting to me. Now let's jump to LGBTQ nonfiction, where Dear Senthuran by Akwaeke Emezi is nominated. This is a memoir of sorts. I am really interested in it because I would love to see what formed Akwaeke Emezi's journey as a writer, but I feel like I should read one of their fiction books first, whether one of the adult ones or one of the, I can't remember if it's young adult or middle grade books that they have written, but I feel like I should read those first. So Dear Senthuran is on my list and I would like to get to it, but I feel like I need to read the fiction books first in order to appreciate it more deeply. That's my thought. If you have read Akwaeke Emezi's work, please let me know what you think in the comment section down below. The next one from the LGBTQ nonfiction category that I want to talk about is Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York by Sarah Schulman. This is a brick of a book. I've seen it. It's a really big book, and I really want to read it. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for it on audio at some point and try to get it in that way, because the story of ACT UP and everything that they achieved and everything that they fought for and the hard battles that they had to fight, I really want to take that in and carry those lessons with me, because I think it's really important. So at some point, I would like to do that. I was already familiar with this book. I don't own a copy, but I would like to seek it out on audio at some point. There are only 2 more books that I want to talk about in this video, and then I would love to hear your opinions on this list in the comment section down below. And both of the books I have left are from the gay memoir / biography category. The first one ties into the one I just talked about. It's Never Silent, ACT UP, and My Life in Activism by Peter Staley. It is the previously untold stories of the life of the leading subject in David France's How to Survive a Plague, including his continuing activism. Now, I have not read How to Survive a Plague. I really want to, and I did not realize that Peter Staley was the central figure or leading subject of that book as well. In 1987, somebody shoved a flyer into the hand of Peter Staley. Massive AIDS demonstration, it announced. After 4 years on Wall Street as a closeted gay man, Staley was familiar with the homophobia common on trading floors. He also knew that he was not beyond the reach of HIV, having recently been diagnosed with AIDS-related complex. A week after the protest, Staley found his way to a packed meeting of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, in the West Village. It would prove to be the best decision he ever made. ACT UP would change the course of AIDS, pressuring the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, and 3 administrations to finally respond with research that ultimately saved millions of lives. Staley, a shrewd strategist with nerves of steel, organized some of the group's most spectacular actions, from shutting down the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange to putting a giant condom over the house of Senator Jesse Helms. Never Silent is the inside story of what brought Staley to ACT UP and the explosive and sometimes painful years to follow, years filled with triumph, humiliation, joy, loss, and persistence. And hopefully this description gives you a clue as to why I think the history of ACT UP that Sarah Schulman wrote is also important and urgent. So both of those books are things that I would really like to get to. The final one is Punch Me Up to the Gods, a memoir by Brian Broom. This was first brought to my attention from the New York Times 100 Notable Books list, which I will also link in the description box down below if you would like more. What they say about it is, Punch Me Up to the Gods introduces a powerful new talent in Brian Broom, whose early years growing up in Ohio as a dark-skinned black boy harboring crushes on other boys propel forward this gorgeous, aching, and unforgettable debut. Brian's recounting of his experiences and all their cringeworthy, hilarious, and heartbreaking glory reveal a perpetual outsider awkwardly squirming to find his way in. Indiscriminate sex and escalating drug use help soothe his hurt young psyche, usually to uproarious and devastating effect. A no-nonsense mother and broken father play crucial roles in our Misfits origin story, but it is Brian's voice in the retelling that shows the true depth of vulnerability for young black boys that is often quietly near to bursting at the seams. I mean, still sounds really interesting to me. I think I have this on my wish list on Libro, and I am going to get to it at some point because it sounds really good and interesting. Now, those are the books that I singled out as the ones that I would be most likely to read. But again, I would really encourage you to explore all the different categories, get to know the books a little bit, pick and choose what you find interesting, and let me know which ones jump out to you the most in the comment section down below. Because as I said, I think it's really important to shine a light on all of the different categories. And it's a little unfortunate that the books that jumped out to me the most happened to come from the gay and the lesbian fiction categories. I have a wheelhouse. What can I say? And I try to push myself to get out of it because I think that's important as well. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.